Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, January 19th, 2006. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing, making beer at home. Well, this week, John Palmer, author of How to Brew, joins us to talk about lagers. It's that time of year when the temperatures drop and our interest rises in the area of cold fermentation. I want to keep the opening comments fairly short this week because I want to get on to our talk with John. But I want to take a minute to thank everyone who's ordered the pre-release version of our all-grain DVD. We've had some really good response, and it's great to see names of people who have ordered our first DVD in the past, and those who have emailed us here at the show along the way, and those who I'm seeing for the first time. So I'm starting to get feedback from some who have already received and watched the DVD, and I appreciate that. And there's some good comments in their emails, in their feedback responses, in how to make the material in the DVD better and more understandable. And we're hearing from our friends in Europe and Australia, so I know the DVD works, at least for them. So that's good news. If you want to learn about the pre-release of our all-grain DVD, go to basicbrewing.com/grain. That's basicbrewing.com/grain. You can get this special version of our all-grain DVD without the fancy packaging for only $10. It's a limited-time deal. We're getting the packaging ready, and I'll have some more editing to do following all the feedback that I get. But after I get the production version, I'll be offering them at the regular price. So thanks in advance for your support on this version. That's basicbrewing.com/grain. Coming up on February 10th and 11th, the International Mead Festival will be taking place in Boulder, Colorado. So mark your calendars for that. We're working on an interview, or getting an interview, with David Myers from Redstone Meadery in Boulder, and we hope to have that in a couple of weeks. But you can go to meadfest.com, that's meadfest.com, to find out more information on the International Mead Festival. 100 brewers in 35 states have joined together to celebrate Ben Franklin's 300th birthday by brewing the same beer. Franklin's birthday was on the 17th of this month, and brewers across the country brewed Poor Richard's Ale to mark the occasion. To see whether you have a participating brewer near you, go to poorrichardsale.com. And I'll put links to all these sites that I'm talking about on basicbrewingradio.com. Another fun link that Rick Sellers from Pacific Brew News Radio sent me was an interactive map to all the breweries and brew pubs in the United States, so you can find the ones nearest you. It's kind of sad, though, for me, because there are only 2 brew pubs in the whole state of Arkansas. That's where I live. But, at least I'm near one of them, and it's a good one, so there is positive there. Peter from Sydney, Australia, sent me the plans for a homemade stir plate made out of a computer fan and a variable speed controller. Some brewers use stir plates with flasks when they make starters to keep the starter in motion. I'll post Peter's plans and a link to the article that he recommends on the BYO magazine site on making starters. And thanks, Peter. I appreciate your help with that. Be sure to check that out. Jim from Lothersdale, England, wrote in to ask why his beer wasn't getting the carbonation in the bottle that he had wanted. Well, to make a long story short, I came up with a few suggestions and then forwarded the question to John Palmer to get his ideas as well, and I appreciate John's help with that. After reading John's and my advice, Jim came up with a brilliant idea on his own. He put a balloon on top of one of the bottles and shook up the beer. Well, soon Jim says the balloon started to inflate. So now Jim thinks he's got a problem with his capper, and he's not getting a good enough seal on his caps, so the CO2 is escaping right out of the top of his beer. So that's excellent thinking on Jim's part. I don't think I would have come up with that. That test may come in handy for others who may suspect they're not getting a good seal on their bottle caps. Just put a balloon on top of your beer. Finally, several of you wrote in to say how much you like the six-pack show and the concept of brewing with very small batches. It is an experiment, and we don't know how it will turn out, but primary fermentation is complete on our six-pack of IPA, and I plan to rack to a secondary in the next day or so and add some whole hops, whole Cascade hops, when I do so, to get some good hop aroma going, hopefully. I'll keep you posted on that. And FYI, I used Designing Great Beers to calculate my ingredients. Some of you asked about that. And some wrote to say that they're already doing small batches of their own after watching us and listening to us do the same thing. So I hope that all of our beers turn out great. It was a lot of fun to do. But now on to our interview with John Palmer. John is in the last stages of editing the 3rd edition of his book, How to Brew. He took a break to talk to us about lagering. There for a while it was getting colder here in Arkansas, but it warmed up to like the 60s and lower 70s again. So lagering, is not so much on my mind as it used to be.
You're a lot better set up for it than we are here. It hit 90 yesterday.
Oh. Well, before we jump into the lagering conversation, I want to address really quickly kind of a controversy that we stirred up, at least among a couple of our listeners. You endorsed aluminum pots the last time you were on the show. I had a couple of people who wrote in who said that, experienced homebrewers and homebrew shop owners had told them that aluminum pots give the beer a metallic taste. So defend your recommendation there, John.
Well, as with everything, I mean, there are always circumstances when you need to be wary of of a recommendation. Such as, oh yes, the water's fine, go right in. No sharks in this area. So with aluminum, it is a very good brewing material. I've been using aluminum for years. Other friends of mine, such as Jeff Renner in Michigan, have been using aluminum for years. And the key is that you want to let aluminum build up a passive oxide, just like on your copper wort chillers. When you use copper to make an immersion chiller, and you put a bright and shiny chiller in your wort, and it comes out bright and shiny, or if you put in a slightly dull chiller in your wort, it should come out slightly dull because that oxide is passive to the wort. It's not going to be attacked by it. Whereas if you put in a dirty, dark, brown, green, oxide-coated piece of copper in your wort, it's going to come out shiny clean, and all that oxide just ended up in your wort.
Mm.
The idea is that you're trying to build up a passive oxide layer that's going to be inert to what you're working with. In the case of aluminum, it's good to boil that when you first use the pot. It's good to fill it full of water and boil it for a little while, because that'll build up a gray oxide on the inside of the pot. And then you can just take a sponge and some ordinary dish soap and wash it out and dry it with a paper towel or a regular towel, and you'll be good to go. That you've kind of seasoned the pot for its first use. If you took one straight out of Walmart that was squeaky clean, shiny bright, and used it straight off to make a batch of beer in, you might end up with some off flavor, but I doubt it. The acid in beer is not that strong, and aluminum is fairly inert to it.
Are there circumstances where people, because of water quality, they might not want to use aluminum?
Well, most areas in the U.S. Have alkaline water, where the bicarbonate levels are anywhere from 50 to 150 parts per million, and the pH of the water is usually 7.5 to 8.5. Water like this will help passivate the pot pretty quickly. It'll build up a dull gray finish, and that's what you want. You want it to have a dull gray finish as opposed to a bright and shiny finish. If you have water that is slightly acidic for whatever reason, or if you're using distilled water or water that has a pH of less than 7, there is more chance that you could cause some dissolving of aluminum or the oxide and get a little bit of aluminum flavor or off flavor. But the yeast really should take care of any of those metal ions Iron, on the other hand, is a problem. The yeast don't take that in, and that does definitely cause off flavors. But I've never had an off flavor with aluminum.
And in the short experience that Steve Wilkes and I have had with his aluminum pot, we've been trading it back and forth. We haven't experienced that either. And in defense of enamel pots, I think you had said that you preferred aluminum over enamel because of the more even heating, and there's more of a chance with enamel from scorching. You know, I've used enamel for most of my brewing career, and have had good luck with it. So,
yeah, I used an enamel pot for years, and before I switched to aluminum. And one reason I switched to aluminum is because it was very easy to drill a hole in the side and mount a brass spigot in it, to help me drain the wort after I'd done boiling it. Things like that. It's hard to drill on enamel.
Right.
So, yeah, enamel works really well. I guess there's more risk with it in terms of potentially scorching your wort, depending on how you're boiling. If you're using a jet burner, propane burner, chances are you will develop some hot spots and potentially scorch the wort. But if you're on the stove with, typical stove gas or electric element, you probably won't. You'll probably be fine.
It's kind of one of those situations where your mileage may vary.
Yes, so, definitely. Yeah.
So we can make recommendations and let them decide on their own and judge from their own personal experience.
That's right.
Well, I wanted to just get that out of the way because that's one of those hot button issues out there that people tend to spend a lot of time discussing. And I wanted to get that discussed with you while you're on the phone here. But let's go on to lagering. Let's start talking about, this is the time of year that people start to or are already thinking about lagering in some parts of the country. Give us some background on lagering. What is it? Where did it come from? And how is it different from ale fermentation?
Well, lagering, of course, starts with the yeast. In Europe, several hundred years ago, and of course, somebody like Dave Logston have a much better history of this than I do off the top of my head. But the brewing practices that they were using helped the yeast evolve into a cold fermentation yeast. The yeast strains also generally gave off more sulfur compounds during fermentation than, say, ale strains of yeast did. It did evolve into a different strain, and as they nurtured that strain and helped differentiate it from ale yeast, they also adapted to cold weather fermentation. Typically, your primary fermentation temperatures with lager yeast are in the 40 to 50 degree F range, which is like 10 to 15 degrees C. There we go. Somewhere in there.
I'll have to take your word for that.
Yeah, come on. I'm probably off by 5 degrees. But, it's 40 to 50 degrees F is your primary fermentation temp. And the fermentation typically takes a week, approximately twice as long as an ale fermentation. And after you've gotten the primary phase out of the way where the activity starts slowing down, you're going to want to lager the beer, and in doing so, you chill the beer down towards freezing. You can take it as low as like 30 degrees F, right? Just below freezing, because the alcohol in the beer will prevent the beer from freezing. And the colder you lager it, the more you can get protein and tannin compounds to complex together and settle out. And that's how you end up with very brilliantly clear lager beers and very smooth tasting beers, because you get these tannin, these polyphenol compounds to complex with protein in the wort, or in the beer, I should say, and settle out. The risk that you run when lagering that cold is that the beer will suddenly freeze on you. And I've had that happen to me, and it's really, really disappointing, to say the least. You can usually, if you don't break the carboy that you're lagering in, you can usually thaw it and revive it.
Well, what are the advantages of lagering? Why would you want to go to all the extra effort and equipment to lager a beer?
Well, lager beer is just a different type of beer to begin with. I mean, you don't get the fruity esters that you do with an ale. You generally get a more malt-dominated flavor profile. You often get a clearer beer due to the lagering, like I mentioned, and it has can have a crisper character to it than an ale. It's a properties of the yeast itself, and the temperature at which you lager at is going to influence that character also. So you've got various flavors that are characteristic of lagers versus ales, and you have some clarity and mouthfeel differences between lagers and ales too.
Now, for a home brewer, and maybe we should separate this out into those who have and those who have not. Those who have a dedicated freezer with a temperature control, and those who kind of have to improvise. What are the best practices? And kind of take us step by step through the lagering process, from a home brewer's perspective.
The lager fermentation, the primary fermentation, is going to take place at 40 to 50 degrees F versus the 60 to 70 degrees F that you typically do an ale fermentation at. Actually, it's more like 65 to 70 in there. And so lager fermentations proceed more slowly, and you need some way of maintaining an even 45 degrees for that fermentation. Some people, in the more northern parts of the country, have that kind of condition in their basement during the winter, or maybe out in the garage. Other people like myself, we have the dedicated refrigerator or chest freezer with the temperature controller on it, where we can maintain that temperature.
You would be a have.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a have-not, so.
Yeah. In Southern California here, I need a refrigerator to ferment ales. I mean, it gets up to 100 during the day here sometimes. So.
Wow.
But you're looking to maintain that lower temperature. If you live in Minnesota or Michigan or the what do they call it, down east, then you may have that temperature just naturally. You can just set the fermenter on the back porch. Then to lager, you're looking to an ice house, something where the temperature is down near freezing, to help the yeast settle out, to help the proteins and the polyphenols settle out and develop that very crisp lager character. And one way that a lot of my friends lager out here is they get a very large chest cooler. I forget what size they are, like 70 quart or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But they're about 3 or 4 feet long, and about 18 inches square, or in the inside. And you can set them up, on their side vertically, and slip your whole carboy inside there with a couple ice packs. And that makes just a nice little cold box that you can lager in. Just pack it with full ice and set it in there, and you've got a lagering cabinet.
I figured out I was playing with potential equipment setups for a lager for this winter, and I discovered that my 10-gallon Rubbermaid cylindrical drinking cooler that I use for mashing, a 5-gallon carboy will fit neatly inside there.
Oh, yeah.
So, that's a potential solution as well.
That is, yes.
Now, when you're pitching your yeast, do you go straight down to 45, or what's the best procedure for that?
There's two schools of thought with your yeast preparation, your fermentation preparation. Very often, you will read yeast instructions that say pitch your yeast at room temperature and gradually lower the temperature of the fermentation over the next day and a half to your intended primary fermentation temperature. You can do that because your diacetyl precursors don't form for the first 12 to 18, 24 hours into the fermentation. They don't start being produced by the yeast while they're going through their rapid growth phase and so on. So you can get lucky and miss generating lots of diacetyl, which is a kind of a buttery off flavor for lagers. You can miss generating the precursors of that compound early in the fermentation. Then the yeast can reabsorb and condition whatever diacetyl was generated later in the fermentation.
So the yeast can get kind of a good head start before you start cooling them down.
Yeah, you can take advantage of higher growth, faster growth to build up a low pitching rate at higher temperatures, and then just about the time that they would start producing lots of diacetyl, or I shouldn't say they don't produce diacetyl, they produce the precursors, and diacetyl forms chemically independently of the yeast. But by the time that would start happening, then the wort is cool enough that they don't produce as much of those precursors. I prefer to cool my wort down to primary fermentation temperature before I pitch. And the reason for that is because if you're cool to start with and you take a cold yeast starter out of the refrigerator and pitch it to the same temperature wort, or a wort that is actually slightly warmer than what you had had it resting at, the yeast get in there and think, okay, it's time to get to work. They acclimate pretty quickly. You have to pitch more yeast when you do that because they don't have that rapid growth phase at warmer temperatures. At cooler temperatures, they work more slowly. So you got to pitch a larger starter. But I feel, and I've talked to heads of yeast companies that also agree that they prefer the flavor of a beer that has been started cold versus one that's been started warm and cooled. And I tried to pin them down and say, what is the advantage? What is that flavor difference? And apparently it's an intangible. There's something about it that they prefer.
Now, how big of a starter and what gravity do you use for that?
1040 gravity is a good starter gravity. It's kind of an average beer gravity, and 1020 to 1040, anywhere in there is acceptable for the yeast. You're not going to shock them with high osmotic pressure, when pitching them to a starter of that gravity. And depending on how strong a beer you're going to make, you're going to need. Let me throw out a couple numbers here. To ferment 5 gallons or 20 liters, 19 liters for 5 gallons, you're going to want somewhere around 110 to 170 billion yeast cells for a gravity that's 1055 or less. So for your Vienna lager, for your Munich Dunkel, for American light lager or American standard lager or Pilsner, 1055 and less, you're going to want 110 to 170 billion yeast cells for that 5 gallons. How do you get there? Well, you take one yeast packet, or like a dry yeast packet. If you're using a dry lager yeast, for instance, I'll just start with that because those contain about 60 billion cells to start with. And so if you pitch that to a 1 liter starter, you're going to get about 125 or 128 billion cells from a 1 quart starter, starting with 1 dry yeast packet. If you start with a Y yeast smack pack, which are 100 billion cells, or likewise the White Labs ready to pitch tube, those are about 100 billion cells also, and you pitch that 100 billion to a 1 quart starter, you're going to end up with about 170 billion cells. And for a 1055 lager, that's just what you want. You want that quantity of yeast going into a cold fermentation to get it, get that to start up within 12 hours, short lag time, and have a nice vigorous fermentation at lager lager primary fermentation temperatures. Higher gravity lagers, such as say 1065 to 1075, you're going to want more in the neighborhood of 225 to 285 billion cells, and that would call for a 3 quart starter, or 3 quart starter from that initial White Labs tube or Y yeast smack pack.
Wow!
Now these are the 125 milliliter. I think they're called Y yeast activator packs now.
I think you're right.
And so one of those has about 100 billion. Pitch it to a 3 quart starter, you'll end up with a 270 billion, which is good for your 1065 to 1075 OG lager. So that's for for a Bock, suitable for a Bock beer. For an Oktoberfest style, something in the neighborhood of 1055 to 1065, you'd be looking at 170 billion to 225 billion, and that would be the equivalent of a 2 quart starter from the 100 billion to start with.
So we've got a good healthy starter, and we've got our wort chilled down to, in your preference, chilled down to fermentation temperature
before you pitch.
Before we pitch, and we pitch, and of course aerate well.
Yep.
And then hopefully off it goes. Right now, is a lager primary fermentation as vigorous as an ale primary fermentation? Not
quite, but it can be. It's not going to have the giant Kreuzen, popping the airlock off the top like you do when you're making a strong ale or a barley wine. But you can get good vigorous lager fermentations when you pitch the right volume of yeast. If you only take the White Labs tube or the 100 billion cells to start with, and you pitch that cold without a starter, you just put into a lager fermentation, it's going to start out slow, and it's going to take 24 hours for you to start seeing some decent bubbling in the airlock, and it's going to be a steady blub 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 blub, but it's not going to be the that you used to seeing from ales. So your pitching rate has a definite effect on the vigor of the lager fermentation, and that will have definite effects on the character of the beer afterwards. The amount of slight esters that you would get in the beer, the diacetyl, the fusel alcohols, acetaldehyde, other various off flavors and intermediate flavors in the lager.
I would assume that it would be better to have a strong, clean fermentation to have the nice, clean characteristics of the lager.
Yeah. If you when you underpitch a lager, you tend to get more esters forming, and of course, an ester or a fruity character in a lager is an off flavor. It's a drawback. You don't want that in a good lager. So you get better results by pitching more yeast. But if you pitch too much, then you can also get off flavors, and you can get more fusel alcohols. You can get more diacetyl. For instance, the acetaldehyde, that green apple flavor, is caused by both over pitching and under pitching, and under aeration. So lagers are trickier beers to ferment than ales. You need to do it. You can't do it too much, and you can't do it too little. Whether it's aeration or if it's your pitching rate, if you want the best lager possible.
So ales are more forgiving.
Ales are more forgiving.
So we're at the end of primary fermentation, and I guess we see our airlock slow down, if not stop, and we've reached terminal gravity. And where do we go from there?
Well, from there you would want to go to your lagering step. But if you've waited that long for the airlock to really slow down, and you've gotten to your terminal gravity, you've missed the opportunity to do a diacetyl rest. And depending on the yeast strain that you're working with, and depending on your aeration and pitching rate when you started that fermentation, you may have a lot of diacetyl still in the beer. And if you rack to another carboy, a 5-gallon carboy, and prepare to lager that beer, you may rack the beer off most of the yeast that would reduce that diacetyl in your beer, and you can cool if you cool it quickly for the lagering phase. The yeast are not going to take up that diacetyl as fast as they would if they were at their primary fermentation temperature. So a diacetyl rest is often recommended, and what you do there is when you're getting down to, you've gotten three quarters of the way to your terminal gravity, and your bubbling rate has gone from a steady high rate to a slower rate, but it hasn't, it's not the 1 per minute kind of thing, but it's still a slower rate, and the krausen hasn't started falling in. You can raise the temperature of the beer at that point to like ale temperature, 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and do a diacetyl rest, and that will increase the activity of the yeast that are still suspended, and they will take up more of the diacetyl and clean up the beer more quickly. Then you can cool the beer and get them to downshift and go through the precipitation reactions I mentioned to enter the lagering phase.
So how long is your diacetyl rest? You warm it up to ale temperature to make sure you clean out all the diacetyl flavors. How long do you leave it at ale temperatures?
1 to 2 days, 24 to 48 hours.
And that's while it's still in the primary fermenter?
Yes.
And then once you go through that, it's time to rack and go into a secondary?
Yep. You can, the last lager that I did, I lagered it in the primary.
Huh.
I didn't rack it.
Really?
Beer turned out great.
How long did it stay on that primary yeast cake?
About 6 weeks total.
Really?
Yeah.
Now that the conventional wisdom would say that you'd be in danger of autolysis.
Yeah, I used to preach heavily about racking and saying, "Oh yeah, you got to rack for best performance," but you really don't.
Now we're going to get letters on that.
Yeah, right. There's best practice and there's what usually works.
Now, is it because that the yeast are at a refrigerated temperature that maybe you don't get the danger of an autolysis? I guess for those who have tuned in, without listening to the whole series of podcasts, autolysis is the degrading of those yeast bodies, giving an off flavor to the beer. But is it because maybe the yeast is refrigerated that you don't get that?
Well, you can still get autolysis in lager fermentations. But It's kind of a, if you have healthy yeast going into the fermentation with good wort nutrition, an all malt or a adjunct, American lager kind of mash, wort going into the fermentation, but one where you've taken care to make sure that you've got the right level of yeast nutrients going into that batch. Good aeration to start with, healthy yeast starting it. Chances of autolysis are really low. I've been brewing, 10, 12 years now, and I haven't had an autolysis batch yet. But I did in fact taste one while I was judging beer earlier this year.
And what kind of taste do you get from autolysis?
It varies. Very lightly autolyzed beer has a yeast taste, or if you open a packet of dried soup, like or chicken noodle or beef noodle, Lipton beef noodle dry soup, or dry bouillon, it has kind of a bouillon smell to it.
Huh.
If it's a little more volatilized, it's more like the smell of a jar of B vitamins. You open up the lid and take a whiff. That B vitamin smell is what the beer smelled and tasted like that I was judging earlier this year, and it wasn't revolting, and I didn't jump up from my chair. It's just like, oh, so here's actually an autolyzed beer. Interesting.
Now, was it a beer that was bad enough to throw away, or was it one of those where you just kind of drink it anyway?
It was bad enough that I took my required 2 sips to judge it, and then didn't have any more. And if I had a keg of that or several bottles of that, I would have thrown it out, because it didn't taste like beer anymore. It tasted like bouillon or B vitamins. It had a meaty, brothy kind of smell and flavor to it, so it didn't taste like beer anymore.
Well, that's a shame. I guess one question that I want to ask is, when you're going when you're doing a diacetyl rest at ale temperatures and you want to get down to lager temperatures, do you go just straight down into 30 degrees?
No, you need to do it fairly slowly. Otherwise, you'll shock the yeast and they'll just flocculate out, and you don't get some of the benefits of the yeast conditioning the beer.
I think I remember reading like 5 degrees a day.
If you just take it down bit by bit, and you're trying to condition the yeast to this colder temperature, and 5 degrees a day. Turn the fridge controller down a little bit every day, and you can get down to 35 degrees and do your lagering for a couple of weeks. You can lager faster. You can condition the beer faster at a higher temperature, like 40 degrees. Let's say you did your primary fermentation at 50 degrees F. You can lager at 40 degrees F in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks, and the warmer temperature is going to allow the yeast to work just a little bit faster and condition the beer a little bit faster, clean up some of those green flavors. The downside of that is you don't get the clearing of the beer, the precipitation of the proteins and polyphenols. So you won't have as clean a lager character as you would if you managed to take it all the way down to 30 to 35 degrees to lager it. You get better precipitation and better clarification of the lager beer at those colder temperatures, and you get a smoother lager beer comparatively.
Is there a difference in after you bottle your lager beer? Should you then keep it in the refrigerator, or does it matter? Can you keep it at your regular storage temperature for your beers?
Once you've lagered it and bottled it, you can just store it at room temperature. You don't have to keep them cold.
So all the work is done, and
yeah,
there's no harm in them coming back up to room temperature at that point.
That's right. In fact, for priming and bottling and carbonation, you're going to want to do that carbonation step at room temperature. It would take, because that way you can get the bottle to carbonate within 1 to 3 weeks. If you tried to do it at lagering temperature still, it would take a month or two to get them to generate that same level of gas in the beer.
And you've already waited longer than normal.
Yeah.
For this beer. Well, now, did you do any, like I said before, you are a have now that you've got a temperature controlled freezer.
Yeah.
Did you do any lagering before you got your freezer, and do you have any advice for people who don't have the facility, either the room or the want to invest in a big piece of equipment like that for lagering?
Don't buy more than you need. When I first started lagering, I had the fridge that I use for primary fermentation, but I didn't have a temperature controller for it, and just trying to go down to, I'm reading books on beer, such as Brewing lager beer. I'm thinking, okay, I want to get right down to 33 degrees. And so I'm tweaking the little controller inside my refrigerator, trying to get down to that, and of course my lager ended up freezing. So after I got it to thaw, I built 3 cold boxes that, don't tell my wife, but probably cost me about $150 in materials. So I could just put ice packs around them and lager them that way, and it worked very well. But, now, subsequently I bought a temperature controller for that fridge, and now I just lager in that fridge using the temperature controller. And I have these 3 cold boxes that sit in the garage that I use for stacking things on.
Well, there's eBay. You can always go John Palmer autographed ice box or cool boxes.
Yeah, I suppose that's an option. I forget that there are other people who would potentially covet these custom built boxes.
Oh, sure. But I've read emails on the show from people who either in warm climates like yours and Hawaii, fashioning using coolers with ice water baths to even get down to ale temperature fermentations. I would guess that would take a little practice and would be a bit tricky to do. But if you had the energy and the time and the want to figure out how to do that, then that is a way that you can lager, without investing in all that stuff.
Or like you mentioned, you setting the carboy in a cooler to help insulate it from the environment works quite well. Your blue ice packs work quite well. I went to the store and bought 10-pound blocks of ice, and also like the 20-pound bags of crushed ice. Those would last 3 or 4 days inside the cooler.
Wow.
It really did keep, and it made me realize that icebox technology that our grandparents used, wasn't that primitive. It actually worked quite well. So yeah, that's definitely a viable option. Also, to emphasize that you can brew lager beers at relatively warm temperatures, 50, 55 degrees for primary, lager at 40 to 45 to 50 degrees if you have to. You can brew good tasting lager character beers at those temperatures. They won't be quite the same as Pilsner or Quell, won't be quite the same as some of the lagers that you're dreaming of, but it will be very close.
And it's homebrew. So,
yeah,
unless you're trying to enter a competition and, you're competing against people who have the freezers, then, you're probably still going to enjoy it. And your friends will, or at least your friends with good taste, are probably still going to be impressed. And it's probably still going to be fun,
Yeah. I like lager beers. I try to brew a Vienna every spring in my annual March beer. That's because our club gets together and does a big club brew in March, and it's easier to pull all the equipment together and and spend a day brewing with my friends than it is to find the time of my own.
You have a manufactured excuse there.
Yeah.
Well, it is. Can you think of anything else that we need to talk about on the subject of lagers?
Let's see. One other thing that's just a handy tip: if you're going to prime and bottle your lager, you've gone through this lagering phase, and a lot of your yeast have settled out, and you're worrying, is my beer going to carbonate? Well, what you can do is take another pouch or another tube of your lager yeast and mix it in at priming time. You don't need to build up a starter. Just that one tube or that one pouch will be more than sufficient. And you can mix that in with your priming, once you've made your priming solution and cooled it, you can mix that in, and that will ensure that you have enough yeast to carbonate quickly.
And same strain that you used for primary fermentation.
Same strain that you originally used, yeah.
It's good advice. You might not get, because the lagers, you are expecting good carbonation.
Yeah, and if your lager happens to freeze, when you're lagering and you thaw it out, chances are, your yeast are pretty well shot at that point, or at least they're not interested in getting back to work. So
they were tired.
Yeah. So yeah, you can do the same thing. You can pitch that extra tube or pouch of yeast to the batch. You want to avoid aeration though, and but add that yeast back in, swirl it up, and that should be sufficient to get the fermentation to finish up.
Well, again, I appreciate your time. And how's the book coming?
Not as fast as it needs to. I've been told I have 10 days left.
Oh my goodness!
So it's there's always one more paragraph that I want to tweak, and I just got a paper sent to me the other day from a friend of mine saying, "Hey, did you see this paper on enzyme activity?" And it's like, wow, what a fascinating paper. That's really interesting. I'd like to incorporate that.
You need a deadline, John.
Yeah.
Well, best of luck on the book, and we look forward to seeing it.
Thank you.
And I appreciate you being on the show.
Anytime. Happy to.
Well, thanks again to John Palmer for joining us. It's always fun to talk to John. You can read the entire first edition of his book at howtobrew.com. That's howtobrew.com. Well, next week I hope to have the first part of an interesting concept for a show. The American Homebrewers Association has provided us with a flavor-active beer taste troubleshooting kit. Well, this kit is called the Enthusiast, and it has samples of 8 off flavors that you can mix into beer to simulate some of the problems you may experience in homebrewing. So a group of us is planning to get together and to sample some bad-tasting beers in the interest of brewer education. And I hope to have at least the first part of that tasting session for next week, so that should be fun. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And if you're wanting to get into home brewing while you're on our site, you can check out our DVD, Basic Brewing Introduction to Extract Home Brewing. We'll walk you through the process step by step. And you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVD. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online. And don't forget about our all-grain pre-release offer on our all-grain DVD at basicbrewing.com/grain. And our Frapper Map. Boy, Lots of people on the Frapper map. It's great to see. Okay, well, that's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time. So long.